Hi, welcome to More Than Theology, the Pathways Bible College podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Sam Bloore, and Sam is a guy that I've known for a few years now and a man with many feathers in his hat. He is a doctor twice over. So he started out his career as a medical doctor, but along the way, he's worked for Venn Foundation. He was teaching pastor at St. Paul's in Auckland, and recently completed a Doctor of Ministry from Fuller Seminary, a seminary that's very close to my heart. And he and I, that's partly how we got to know each other a little bit, is just through that Fuller connection. And and he's very in demand as a speaker at Pathways. We've called on him and his services before. He's an incisive cultural commentator. And it's a real delight to have you on the podcast today, Sam. Welcome along.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, great to be here and to be able to finally have this conversation. I know you and I have actually connected on this topic a few times and bounced ideas around. So nice to be able to sit down with a bit of time and thrash it out. Yeah.
So the topic is one that I'm just fascinated by, and we have talked about it just you know, off air, if you like, plenty of times, because I'm just really fascinated by it. But it's this phenomenon, emerging adulthood. And I know for you, Sam, it's one that you sort of had a personal journey towards in terms of discovering this phenomenon. Yeah. So just tell us about it and how you got there, what even it is. Like, what is emerging adulthood?
Yeah, and those two things will sort of intertwine as I tell you about how I discovered it, and then the realizing how personally I'd walked that particular journey through the decade of my 20s in what was being described in the literature at the time. So probably a couple of things to say right up front. If people have tuning in have heard me speak on this before, then there will be some repetition, because over the years, one of the reasons this has bounced up in conversation, Richard, for us a few times, is that I've been looking at this for a long time. You know, my journey at Fuller ended up, because of COVID and everything else, taking about 6 or 7 years to actually work my way through all the papers and then the final project. And I was able to look at some cohorts of the fellows that were going through the Venn Foundation's residential fellowship and connect with them. And so much of what I learned comes courtesy of conversations I had with them along the way too. So just sort of acknowledging them as well. And it sort of took a while. So it's been bouncing around for a while and has finally come together. And so you're very brave asking someone who's finished their doctorate within a year of them doing it, what they can all come sort of pouring out. You'll have to cut me off every 15 minutes so I can draw breath. But look, I came across this while I was helping a friend to deliver a paper for a chaplaincy course. They were actually doing they were delivering a chaplaincy diploma, and one of the papers was looking at the life stages, all the life stages from cradle to grave. Obviously, if you're a chaplain, you can go into a chaplaincy in lots of places. You can be a chaplain in a hospital. You can be a chaplain in a hospice with people right at the end of life. You can be a chaplain in the army. You can go to all of these different places and be a chaplain. So knowing something about different stages of life is very important for them to do it. And this paper was doing that. And I was, partly because of my medical background, that asked, would you be interested in helping to deliver that paper? And that was when I first heard this described. And it really came out of the work of a guy called Jeffrey Jensen Arnett. He was a psychologist and did a lot of work in sort of psychology and sociology. And his graduate work had been on adolescence. And he was looking at adolescence and that time of life from 13 through to 18 to 20-ish. And he did his doctoral work on that. He did his postdoc work on that. And then he finally landed himself into a tenure track job as an associate professor somewhere. And that happened in his mid-30s. He landed a job with a stable career, stable income, a career, tenure track job. And so he found himself going, okay, well, I've actually pulled enough together to settle down, to make some of those sort of changes. I think he then proposed to his long-term and perhaps long-suffering partner of the time. And he goes, man, I'm mid-30s and I'm making these kind of changes or life milestones that my parents did a decade and a half earlier. I wonder if anyone else is doing it. So his own journey started autobiographically. So he switched his area of research from adolescence to what happens after 18 and started looking at 18 to 25s. And about 3 years later, he published a paper in which he proposed that just as adolescence had evolved as a new life stage that was described in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, this had happened again. Prior to 1930, I think, you won't find reference to adolescence. You know, people were kids, they were older kids, and then they were an adult, you know, or a young adult. You know,
Yeah.
And as people stayed longer in high school and did other things, they realized that their life experience was changing so much that it deserved to be looked at as a discrete life stage. Well, he said the same thing has happened. 18 to 25 is now so different to how it was experienced, say, 2 or 3 generations ago, that we need to look at it as a discrete life stage. And he proposed calling it emerging adulthood. When he put that paper out, when I last looked, I think it had been cited something like 14,000 times on Google Scholar. So in other words, it's been cited in 14,000 other papers or references. It became a paradigm shifting paper, and it was it was as though sociologists and psychologists the world over just let out this kind of collective, yes, you're describing something that we've all seen. We haven't had words to articulate it. And within 2 years, there was a Journal of Emerging Adulthood. They were having a conference once every couple of years. Things just really took off from there. There is still some argument about whether or not it deserves to be called a discrete life. Like, should it be an actual separate life stage? Look, the jury's still out on that a little bit. But it's one of those things where I'm kind of like, that to me became much more, that was just a detail I wasn't worried about, because as I went through the features of it, as I read about the features of it, it just really resonated with what I had experienced myself, but also what I was observing. And so I described 5 features of emerging adulthood. And they are identity exploration. So it's a time of life where you explore what life is going to look like in lots of ways.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that identity word a bit later on, because I think as Christians we've got some different ways we want to talk about identity, particularly how we ground our identity in Christ in some foundational ways, in some ways that influence absolutely everything about our lives.
Yeah, sure.
Using the language of the literature, he says we're exploring what we're to do in life, particularly vocationally and relationally. And he actually references Freud. So it was Sigmund Freud who said that the 2 great projects of adult life are work and love. So we're working out what we're going to do in our work, in our vocation, in our service to our communities, and we're working out what love is going to look like. Not just romantic love, but our platonic loves, our loves within wider family and friend networks. My supervisor, Stephen Argue, and some others would agree with one of the things that Arnett proposed throwing in there as well, and that is we work out what our worldview is going to be. How are we going to make sense of some of our deep foundational beliefs about the way that the world works? And I think that's a great addition. And particularly in Christian life, we're working that out. We're starting to say, does the faith that I perhaps grew up with in my family, am I going to own that? Am I going to individuate and make that my own in particular ways? And so any parents listening who perhaps they're younger emerging adults or late teenagers are starting to really kick against the goads a little bit, or starting to really question certain things, I'd say that's actually a natural process. And don't be put off by that. Don't feel insecure about that. Don't feel like you've dropped the ball or you've done something wrong. You probably have. We all have. No parent's doing it perfectly. No church is doing it perfectly. But it's a natural process to want to actually work out, does this faith work for me? Am I going to follow in the footsteps of my family? Or perhaps if you came from a household that didn't have any faith, am I going to own this for myself? So that's identity exploration. And that is happening later than it was described earlier. Some of the child psychologists talked about that happening in the teenage years. That's sort of happening a little bit later, identity exploration. The second one that he points to is instability, and really this is the flip side of the coin. You can't explore lots without it feeling a little bit unstable. You can't just halfway through university that you're gonna switch majors from law to the arts and not have some change. You're gonna change classes, you're gonna change tutorials, you're gonna perhaps even change campuses. That's going to bring about change. An interesting statistic is that people will live across populations, this is true, that people will live in more locations in their third decade, so in their sort of 20s, 18 to 20, 28, 29-ish, than any other decade of their life. And some people will live in more locations in that decade than all the other decades put together. I haven't quite done the stats on my own life, but that would almost be true of me, I think. That I lived in so many different flats and hostels when I changed university and things like that. You know, that's certainly true. And that brings with it a bit of instability. There's a feeling that things are shifting and changing. It doesn't have to be really distressing or disorienting, but it can be. It can feel as though there's a lot changing. There's a lot up for grabs. The road to adulthood is a much more winding one than it used to be. The third one is self-focus. So the third feature. Stop me along the way, Richard, if you've got questions on any of these. But
yeah, sure.
I'll run through these as quickly as I can. The third one is he calls self-focus, and when I show PowerPoints of this, I often have as my slide for this a picture of Narcissus sort of gazing into the pond at his own reflection, which is a bit unfair. It's not meant to be. It's not meant to be negative. It's not meant to say you're going to become a narcissist or you're going to become selfish or self-absorbed. Although I think left unchecked it can be, and I think all of these have got potential pitfalls or potential idolatries for us as Christians. But all Arnett is identifying here and focusing our attention on is that this is a time of life where you can make decisions and really for the most part, take only yourself into account. So I'll give you an example of my life. I was working my first couple of years out. I worked at Whangarei Base Hospital. Up there, I did my sort of house surgeon rotations. And I found out in my second year that our hospital had an arrangement with a hospital in Perth, and we could do one of our rotations over there and just switch with, a young doctor from over there would come here and do ours, and we'd go over there and do their work. And so with 3 months' notice, I upped and off to Perth. My wife, Julia, would have something to say about that if I announced that in 3 months' time we were taking off, and I couldn't have done that when I was living at home with mum and dad either. So what Arnett is identifying is that when we live at home, we've got household rules to follow, whether we live with mum and or dad or some other sort of guardians or siblings or whatever. We actually got to follow a pattern of life. Later in life, if we've settled down, we've got a stable partner, spouse, we've got kids, it becomes much harder just to up and make decisions in a self-focused way. But you can do that in the emerging adulthood years. Now, obviously, there's limits. You can't just chuck your job in and have no repercussions from it. And there's often flatmates to take into account and things like that. But you're able to do that. The fourth feature is feeling in between. And this one is really self-reported. It's entirely subjective. This is coming about not through just observing what emerging adults are doing, but asking them how they are feeling. And they're feeling in between. It's called the response that you get. And so when you ask emerging adults, particularly in the early emerging adulthood years, if they feel as though they've reached adulthood, a majority of them will give quite an ambiguous answer. So I think I can remember most of the stats roughly off the top of my head. At sort of 21 to 23, they'll tend to answer. A third of them will say, yes, I've reached adulthood. 2/3 of them will give an ambiguous answer. They'll say, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no.
Right.
On some days, it depends what day you ask me, they might say. They'll often make a big deal about it. Or they'll say, oh, gosh, I've just been promoted at work. I've now got a team of 4 answering to me, but I got home at 3 a.m. On Saturday night after a big night out. Like, what is that? Or I had ice cream for breakfast last night. That doesn't really make. Mum would have something to say about my adulting if that was the case. So they'll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, just that word. You said adulting.
Yes.
And I almost wonder. I think about that. The way that word is used these days. It's a noun, adult or adult, but these days gets used as a verb as well. Adulting, and I almost wonder if that's part of that ambiguity where it's. You don't really feel like an adult, but you still got to go and do some adult-like stuff, paying bills and so forth, and that's adulting. Almost just it's just a mode that you enter into somewhat uncomfortably, but you're not really there. You're kind of faking it until you make it.
Yep, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen that word evolve in that way and be used in that sort of way. Again, often quite tongue-in-cheek, right? It's used in a way that's got some humour attached to it, or look at me. Someone will take a snapshot of themselves down at the paying for their car insurance or something. Look at me adopting. It's sort of like I use that example because my dad did my insurance until I was into my 30s. Partly because he didn't pay for it. I was sending him through the money, but he was just doing it because when I get home, as an 18-year-old, they added it to one of their policies. And that just sort of ticked over. And finally, at about 35, he said, "Hey, mate, I think you got this. I think." Yeah. So that by the end of the 20s, 2/3 of people will say an unambiguous yes, like I've actually reached adulthood. But still, a third will say it depends. Depends what you put me on. Yeah. So it's and the milestones now of marriage, first kid, buying a house, they're not happening. They're happening a decade and a half later than say our grandparents did things, again across populations, and replacing those really has been when Arnett asked emerging adults what are the things that make you feel like you can give a yes to that answer. The responses he got were things like taking responsibility for yourself, becoming financially independent, starting to accept the consequences for my actions in particular ways. Though these things start to happen gradually, and so he said it's not surprising that the feeling happens gradually. And then the final one is he calls possibilities and optimism. So he says partly because the exploration is taking longer and the options are before us. It's in those emerging adulthood years you realize you haven't fully burned any bridges. I was able to make that change out of medicine into more related work in my late 20s. Again, that would have been harder to do if I'd met Julia and we'd been married with kids by that stage. I hadn't done that. Happened even later. So again, for me, that was very, very so personal in that way. But yeah, that's just so one of the things where they are responding in those ways and saying these things are happening gradually. My feeling of this is happening gradually, and so the possibilities that are open to me, I can actually change without too much repercussion. So again, my supervisor Stephen Argue describes it almost as the first half going like this, and then the second half starting to go like this. So he talks about explorers in the first half of the emerging adulthood years, and then focusers starting to go. Turns out I can't do everything. I've got to rein this in a little bit and decide which bucket am I going to land in vocationally? I'm going to have to live somewhere. I can't keep traveling. I can't keep bouncing around if in fact that's been the pattern someone's been following. And then there's a real optimism in those years as well, that they're going to land a good job, that they're going to, things are going to turn out okay for them. He said, and rightly so. It should be a really a positive time of life. This is probably the feature I get the most pushback on, actually.
Yeah.
Possibilities and optimism.
Yeah.
And partly because some of the cultural changes we're seeing. People are going, hey, the economy's screwed, the environment's screwed. Yeah. We've got more conflict, certainly globally, like actual conflicts, but conflict racially, conflict between the sexes. We're seeing all of these things at each other. Is it really, is it a kind of optimism and possibilities? And Arnett has responded to that, and not, things have come a long way since 2000. He's responded. He's on to the third edition of his book, which only came out 2 years ago. He's continued to push back and say, actually, if you ask specific emerging adults, they're often quite positive. They're often still quite optimistic about their ability to somehow work their way through the matrix and land somewhere pretty positive.
Right.
The world might be a much more challenging place, but I'm still gonna. He's a little bit humorous with this. He said they all think they're going to land an amazing job, the job of their dreams, marry their soulmate, and have a house in the leafy suburbs with 3.2 kids or 2.3 kids who are all above average. He said there is a positivity, and I would say that's a good thing. But he said that who's going to be holding those people when that positivity actually starts to bump into real life, and you start to realize that Yeah, and we can.
Well, that's right.
Some of that as we move into the second half of this, when we talk about how do Christian communities support people in this time of life, and so some of those realities start to bite. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of pushback, if we could call it that, for me, when you talked about optimism, I mean, there's a equal and opposite flip side to that. It seems to me, I'm just thinking about my own experience. I remember saying to my home group when I was sort of in my mid 30s, I was doing a doctorate at the time. I was still kind of figuring out, like, yes, I was married. Yes, I had children. Yes, I had a house. But in terms of like work, I still felt like I was figuring it out. I was doing a doctorate, but that won't go forever as much as I might try to make it so. And I just remember saying, I'm really sick of feeling like I'm striving. And I think it was this feeling of like what was like possibilities and optimism in my 20s was starting to just feel like a lostness or an uncertainty that was pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right, and I think being able to talk about these sorts of things in ways that are really just honest is a really good place to start. Whenever I've spoken about this, after outlining the 5 features, generally if we're doing a sort of a group session or with a group, like sometimes a seminar or a lecture with maybe 60 people in the room, I'll say, turn to your neighbour now and have a yarn about, did any of those 5 features kind of resonate with you? Does that describe where you're at now, if you're in those 18 to 29? So Arnett described 18 to 25, but he was very relaxed as other researchers picked up and joined him in that work. He was very comfortable with that stretching out to include the whole third decade, so the whole decade of the 20s. So that's more or less where the researchers focus. So leaving home,
Okay.
18, 19 through to end of the 20s. And, as I was saying, I was reading this for the first time, reading these features and thinking I could have been a poster boy for this. Like, this absolutely describes my 20s.
Yeah.
And everyone that was going through our Venn programs at the time, they by definition fitted into this demographic. And so I was seeing some of it in the work that I was doing too. And my colleagues there who, still running that fellowship, my wife Julia and I, we left Venn several years ago now, but we're still, sort of real supporters of them in the background, to them whenever we can, sort of say, hey, if you're at that time of life, they offer some really great courses to do, some really foundational and formational content and programs there. But we were seeing it, and my colleagues there were seeing it too, and we were saying, how do we respond to that? And so, if we sort of moving in a moment into the second half of where I took the research to go, what would be helpful at this time? Well, the first thing that comes up time and again is just conversations around this. So you saying then, Richard, that you were feeling this into your 30s while being married, having kids, but still with vocational questions looming over you. I think talking about that is just really, really helpful for people. They're just like, oh, okay, great. We can talk about that. We can have some conversations about it. And I myself, ironically, would be speaking out of this when I was lecturing at Venn, but about 3 years ago, I was doing it. And one of the things I would remind them is that we do have some cultural narratives that are very they've been put through a filter, right? They've been put through a meme or a filter to look really great. My wife Julia, when we had 3 at home under 3.5, and so we having started late, had to move quickly, have the kids. They're moving through as a very tight little cohort, But she started posting these Instagrams of, I think she picked it up from another woman at our church that did it, just posting these photographs of just like piles of washing just on our couch,
Yeah. Yeah.
Because she was like, everyone's Instagram is of us looking amazing here, us looking sort of taking my kids to the zoo again, or here I am doing this, that, or the other thing. And she was like, here's what our house looks like. That's 3 loads of washing sitting right there on the couch, we're TV sitting on the floor. And she started this little thread that was called #breaking the illusion. And people just piled on it and just added their own hilarious shots from around the house of what their house actually looked like, what did life actually look like, rather than the broadcast, the Instagram-worthy version of my life. And so I think being able to be honest about that and talk about it is just really helpful. And so one of the things I would say in that was, God doesn't owe you. He doesn't owe you your dream job. He doesn't owe you a job that's going to push all of your creative buttons. He may actually place you somewhere doing some work for a period of time, a season that's just really, really mundane, really, really boring. It might be just deeply, at one level, unsatisfying. Oh gosh, I'm going to forget the commentator. Was it? I think Zygmunt Bauman was one of the people who first described. I'm quoting a quote. So Tim Chester referenced it in a book he wrote called "The Busy Christian's Guide to Busyness," and he said that Zygmunt Bauman was the first. He said described that we're one of the first generations that requires our work to be intrinsically fulfilling. It needs to be fulfilling in and of itself, rather than extrinsically fulfilling. And what he meant by that is that people used to do their job back in medieval times. You were working your plot of land and you were milking your cow, and that was helping to support and sustain and nourish your family, and any little extra you sold at market, and you did your work, and God saw your work and God was happy, and you were happy because he was happy. The fulfillment came extrinsically. But he said we're now all tyrannized by the fact that our work needs to be intrinsically fulfilled. It needs to be fulfilling in and of itself. And that's an arms race you won't win.
Yeah, and a great word for it too, tyrannized. That just kind of puts a different lens on what is often, I guess, kind of romanticized, right? Is like trying to having work that is intrinsically fulfilling. I think on the conversation piece, just even having a term for this life stage, emerging adulthood, is helpful because it gives it's a handle, and that was my experience when I first heard of it. Was like, finally I've got a handle, because the experience I talked about before, where I'm trying to find the words for it in my home group setting, and I sort of settled on striving, but just having that handle and a label and a kind of conceptual box, I guess, for it makes the conversation easier to have.
Yes. One of the sections in my final write-up, just in one of the chapters, I mean, as you know, these things just blow out, right? So you got chapters and then sort of subsections and things. But one of the subsections, I referenced that exact thing, and I borrowed a phrase that I think child psychologist Daniel Siegler, sort of a well-known, sort of popular psychologist, does a lot of work. He's got a phrase, "name it to tame it," and it's a phrase that's used in child psychology to help kids name the feelings that they're feeling. It's kind of blowing your stack. Well, you're angry, aren't you? Or you're frustrated, or you're this, you're that. You're sort of naming something helps a kid helps to tame that.
Yes.
Well, I sort of borrowed that and said, naming this helps to tame it. Naming some of these features helps to tame them, helps you to know what they are. You can have conversations about them. Just to be armed with that nomenclature is helpful.
Yeah, 100%. Hey, this is a tangent, 100%, but I'm just so curious about it. Something you were saying earlier just made me wonder, have you ever thought about where the OE fits into this? Like this sort of rite of passage that seems to be a part of at least some sectors of New Zealand life?
Yes. Yeah, that was interesting. I didn't specifically look at that. You'll probably know that journey that you go on when you're writing up something of this size, and mine wasn't the size that yours was, Richard, but mine got big enough. But I was, time and time again, my supervisor would just say, "Mate, you got to rein it in. You've actually got this is starting to slip outside the boundaries of the narrower focus." So I didn't look specifically at that. If you go back to the 1970s and 80s in New Zealand, there was that well-worn path. You'd go on an OE. It was always to the UK. You'd live in, there were suburbs of London that was 30% Kiwi because of how many Kiwis were in the flat there. You'd go off and do a Kontiki tour that always included Oktoberfest and a trip to Gallipoli. There were these things that marked your OE. I think New Zealanders are still travelling a lot. Yeah, the OE It's just as likely that people would go to North America now for their OE, although in recent years it's probably a little less popular.
Yeah.
But go somewhere, go to Southeast Asia, go somewhere else. It doesn't tend to follow the go back to the motherland, England, for the experience in quite the same way. But travel is still has been a feature. And again, because of the self-focus thing I mentioned earlier, you can do it with less cost. Professionally and vocationally at that time of life. By midlife, people tend to be more settled into careers. So if you move then, it tends to be to take up a promotion in the Sydney office or in the the New York office or something like that. You tend to make it vocationally led rather than exploring. It's led because you're following a vocational thread rather than you're just following an adventurous spirit.
Yeah. I sent you on a bit of a tangent, but before I think you were talking about, you started off with conversation, like sort of some of the responses, I guess, we might have to emerging adulthood. So conversation's one. Are there others?
Yeah, there are. So that one really, I came up with 5 things that I thought were helpful for Christian communities, for families, parents, just to be aware of in the lives of their emerging adults. And so actually the conversations wasn't one of them. That's almost like a pre-thing. It's like, let's just have some...
right, okay. Yeah.
I'll run through those as well. And those 5 don't map onto the 5 features. They're not designed to do that. But they're just, 5 seemed... I had to stop the number somewhere and a good number of sort of things to try and point people towards as being helpful at this time of life. As we support emerging adults through what can be just a really awesome time of life, I can remember speaking at one of our, just sharing some of what I'd found with our staff, and I think we might have only had 1, maybe 2 emerging adults on our staff at the time, people who were in that zone, and one of them sort of said, hey, is there anything positive about this time of life? And I realised inadvertently I'd talked about the challenging part of it, and you've got all these options, but they can be paralysing and all of this stuff, and I was like, absolutely it can be. And I think how do we as Christian communities, churches, other places get alongside emerging adults, encourage them, support them, help disciple them at this time of life? And so, having conversations, there were 5 things that flowed out of that. The first one, and really where I spent a lot of my project focusing on, was kind of like a biblical anthropology. I called it a biblical anthropology. Just anthropology is sort of picking up on the technical term for just the understanding of the human person. We're at a time of life where a lot of what we're hearing and seeing around us about who we are as people, and not just our right to determine who we are, but our duty. It's your duty to find yourself, to look deep inside who are you. And again, if we want to return to that word tyrannizing, that's just an ontological weight we were never designed to carry.
Yeah, wow.
So we end up with what society declares, what culture declares as this freedom, ultimately becomes enslaving as we're trying to find out, who am I? I mean, you talk about how difficult it was to work out what's my vocation going to look like. Well, what if on top of that you're having to work out who you even are as a person, as a center of being. And so I think, as Christians, mercifully, we're spared that, and we ground our identity in Christ. I think I started referring to that in my project initially, perhaps a bit glibly, and again, my supervisor, Stephen Argue, he zoned in like a laser beam on that. He said, you can't just say, our identity's in Christ. He's like, that's on every Christian bumper sticker and bookmark that ever there was, right? Like, what does that mean? And he very helpfully guided me to unpacking that actually in Christ helps to amplify all of these other aspects of who I am. He helps to actually define them and draw those out and bring those into the light and add colour to them in particular ways. And that sits alongside vocation. Yeah. And at one point in the project, I quoted, it might actually be Foster. So Foster looks at stages of faith. Yeah. He quotes Walter Brueggemann at one stage and says that all questions of identity end up becoming questions of vocation. And what Brueggemann means by that is that we work out these things in our lives vocationally. And so I'll give you a couple of examples of that. When our oldest child was born, when Eden was born, Dad got added to my identity. I wasn't a dad before that, and I became a dad, you know. And so, wow, that gets sort of added to your identity, but working out how to be a dad gets added to my vocation. I'm vocationally working out what that is. Again, helpfully, several commentators have said our vocation isn't just our paid work. Our vocation, we many of us get to work in paid employment. Many of us don't. But if we do, that's an aspect of how we serve our communities and our paid work. But I'm also a neighbour. I'm placed here. I've got neighbours left and right of me. I've got an actual suburb that I live in. I'm called to serve that place in particular ways. I'm part of a church community. That's a part of my vocation too, as the body ministers one to another in that sort of a way. And so it's helpful to be reminded that our vocation doesn't equal our paid work or our career path. I've got different parts of my vocation, and being a dad got added to my identity as an ontological reality, but then working out what that is vocationally becomes something I've just got to do day to day.
It's a great way to think about it. I love that. It's really helpful because I really resonate with what you're saying, or what Stephen Argue was saying about the bumper stickers of identity in Christ. And so I think that's a really helpful way to think about it in terms of identity and vocation. And it's true, like there's a sense in which even just the life of discipleship as a whole, I guess, follows that pattern where your identity is in Christ, but what does that mean? Well, that's a lifetime of working that out.
Yes. Yeah. Another example that I use in that whole sort of identity versus vocation example is that, I'm a fair-skinned, 52-year-old, New Zealand-born European male, and those are aspects of my identity. That's who I am. Those things aren't gonna change. But I think Brueggemann's right. I've got to work out what does that mean vocationally for me. Like, what does that actually mean for me to be that person in my very ethnically diverse suburb? We live here in sort of Linfield, Mount Roskill area. It's one of the most ethnically diverse suburbs in Auckland, and has been historically. So what does it mean for me to do that and to outwork that? What does it mean in my increasingly racially charged nation? Just with some of the questions that were thrown into the mix with the Treaty Principles Bill and some of the tensions and the conflict that brought. Like, what's the Lord asking of me in that space? Those become vocational questions that flow out of aspects of our identity. So I've just found that a really helpful way to frame it, and I think biblical anthropology sits at the heart of that. And as you were saying earlier, we've got to work out what does it look like for us to walk with Jesus in that, and for that to be a day by day thing that we're out working. And so perhaps to jump to the next thing that I thought was helpful flowing on from that is actually that experience of that relationship with Jesus actually is one of the things that I highlighted as being really important. And partly that's because it's really personal work that's being done. We're actually working out who we are. We are taking our place in the world of adults and in the world of the world stage, if you like, even if it's a very modest corner of the stage or the sandpit that we've been asked to play in. We're starting to do that, and that's important work. We need to know that we're doing it alongside the Lord, and that He knows who we are, and that we're experiencing Him in certain ways. I mentioned before we started recording, Richard, that I'm really enjoying your book, the book that you wrote, Seeing is Believing, actually encountering God in film. And as you've described some of your experiences in that book of being moved, I'm sitting there going, yeah, I've had that happen as well. I've sat in movies and gone, gosh, man, I'm being moved in some ways. God, you seem present to me through this unlikely medium, and what's going on there. I'm always a little saddened if I ask people, when did you last really, sort of encounter God or know that God knew who you were? And someone gives an example from an Easter camp, so 8 years ago. I'm like, that's awesome. And you know, if that was a real mountaintop experience that they had, really just God spoke to them in some profound ways. But I'm sort of like, hopefully you've known that he's with you since then. You know, hopefully it's not 8 years between drinks, right? Like, you need to know that God is there. And I mention that so that emerging adults will be reminded themselves that you don't, that there wasn't a youth group phenomenon. We don't put away those childish things, you know. It's not one of the childish things that we put away. There are certain things that we do, but knowing who God is and knowing that God knows who we are isn't one of them. And so that's one of the things that I included. And I actually borrowed that off David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock's book, Faith for Exiles. They opened with that. They opened with we need to have our own personal relationship with the Lord that is grounded and is secure in biblical understandings. We don't go sort of off on our own spiritual journey creating our own religion, but we do that grounded in Scripture. But as people like Dallas Willard say, if we're grounded in Scripture, then we can expect the kind of relationship with the Lord that people in Scripture had. Well, as we read Acts and we see that the church being birthed, we see people actually encountering God in particular ways. So that's the second one. The third thing that I think is really helpful is that we're having conversations with emerging adults about how to discern culture well. So cultural discernment was number 3 for me. Again, I'm probably giving them in a different order than I gave them last time I spoke on this, but learning how to discern culture well. And again, I've told this story before many times too, but when I was growing up, there was sort of like a modern day parable that we used to get told, which was that bank tellers don't learn how to recognize counterfeits by looking at counterfeits. They study real money, and they're just put in a place where they just have enough real money passing through their fingers that they just learn to know a counterfeit as soon as they encounter one. And I remember at the time going, oh, wow, that's a really cool little parable. That the meaning of it seemed pretty obvious. It's like if you just steep yourself in the Word and in good theology and ground yourself in that, then you'll know a counterfeit as soon as it arrives. Read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, as the song went. And I can remember at the time, I must have heard that first when I was 13 or 14, going, man, that's amazing. That sort of modern day story might still be doing the rounds. But as I've gotten older, and particularly as I've looked at this, I've thought, I'm not so sure, actually. And at times that can be terrible advice. And it turns out it's terrible advice for bank tellers. There was a blog piece that I came across where another cultural commentator decided to go along to his local, he lived in Canada, and so he went along to one of the, what do you call the places where they make the money, the printing, the mint, the mint, the mint in Canada. And he actually booked in, did their tour, and then asked someone afterwards, how do you guys spot counterfeits? How do people in banks spot counterfeits? And they said, they do study counterfeits as well. Yes, they lots of money, real money. They get used to that, but they actually look at counterfeits because some of the little changes can be so subtle. You've got to know exactly where on the note to look, and you'll only know to look there by looking at it. And so, again, I think we need to, as well as looking at the real thing, of course, we need to be sometimes holding a cultural narrative up and going, let's have a really close look at this. Because there are some parts of this that look really good, look really compelling, look as though they're the real thing. But actually, as we study it carefully and we hold it up alongside a scriptural account of, say, the human person or a gospel-shaped lens, we actually see there are differences. That as we overlay those two things, we see that there are parts where this is off by a couple of degrees, and if you follow that long enough, you're going to end up way off base. And so, learning how to do that. One of the, I think, most alarming statistics actually came from a guy called Christian Smith. He wrote a book called Lost in Transition, where he really did focus on some of the negative sides of this emerging adulthood time of life. And he wrote a chapter called Morally Adrift, where, again, he's not looking at Christian populations. He's looking right across particularly North American populations and saying people just aren't being aren't being taught, they're not being told, they're not being invited into any frameworks to help them appraise the goodness or the badness, the rightness or the wrongness of anything. The positivity or the negativity, the flourishing or destruction of anything. He actually wrote a book, I think, called To Flourish or Destruct. He just said no one is feeling confident, having sort of kicked all the chairs, all the legs out from under the stool culturally. Everyone's nervous to go pointing and saying that is the right way forward. He said all we can really do is say follow your own intuitions. And he said emerging adults end up not being able to even really discern that there's a dilemma there to be grappled with half the time. So one of the things that they researched was they asked them to identify a moral dilemma in their lives, and many of them couldn't even do it. But there was this remarkable and ironic confidence that their gut would know when it mattered. And that so long as no one was being quote unquote harmed, they could do whatever they liked and let the chips fall where they may. And so I think that can be really looked at in some kind of really negative ways, and there can be a lot of hand-wringing done. But I think it actually should give us real confidence to go, no, we're told a few things. We're invited into a way of being in the world, and we're shown some principles to follow that are really helpful. And can really help you navigate your way through life. Yeah, so I think cultural discernment is another good one.
So that's 3? Is that we're up to
3?
Yeah.
The next one I called saints and exemplars. So that's finding people in life who can help us along the way. I went with saints and exemplars because I can't remember who said that for every book written by someone who's alive, you should read a book by someone who's dead. I don't know. Was it C.S. Lewis who said that? Sounds like the sort of thing C.S. Lewis would say.
Sounds like, very much so.
And I think that's true. I think I've been mentored from afar. I've been mentored across the decades or across the centuries, but I've also been mentored across the world from people I've never met. But I've read their material. It's been really helpful. So some of that can be from the saints who have gone before or are distant to us geographically, but also we need exemplars. We need people who are in our orbit, are in our life, that we can have face-to-face encounters with. They can encourage us. They can challenge us when they need to. I often tell the story of catching up with an old family friend who started going to our church, and I hadn't seen this guy since I was in my pre-teen years, 11, 12. But then he walks into church, 20 something, almost 20 years later. I'm in my late 20s, maybe mid 30s by then, because I was starting to see Julia. We were hanging out, and we chatted about lots of stuff. We caught up, but then I proceeded in over 20 minutes or so to have a bit of a grizzle about some of the things that were wrong with Jules. And he listened patiently and sipped his coffee a couple of times. And at the end of about 15 minutes, he just looked at me and said, "Hey, that's all you, bro. Like, you got to sort that out. And if you don't, you're possibly going to ruin the best thing that's happened to you in the last wee while." And I sat there like I've been sort of slapped across the face. And my first reaction was like, oh, wow. But my second reaction was, that's awesome. Like, how great that someone with enough relational capital historically in the bank who knows me well enough to just call me out at a time where I needed to hear some hard truth. And he and his wife actually ended up doing our pre-marriage course with us, because I thought anyone who's able to give it to me that honestly. So what am I saying? I'm saying we need face-to-face encounters where people can get to know us, where we can build that sort of relationship, where they can encourage us, they can know us well enough to call parts out of us, but also can at times maybe challenge us, correct us if we need it, do those sorts of things. I think we need that in a couple of areas of life. I think we need that in the area of relationships, actually, and not all emerging adults will be in romantic relationships. Some may never find themselves in that romantic relationship that's going to go the distance. But I think it is an area of life where we do need some help, where we need good people around us. That was my experience. It's been my experience as Jules and I have now walked with a number of couples as they've been preparing themselves to get married. And also vocationally, I think we need people around us to help us discern the kind of tensions that you were describing, sharing with your home group
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
I think when
Yeah.
the options are myriad, we need people who can go, you know what, man, you're really good at that. I could see you
Mm,
working with people. I could see you
mm,
working in a job that's just really strategic. I could see you. I actually wish I had a few more older people around me at
mm,
that time where I was deciding where to go
mm,
in life.
mm.
As I reflected on it later, I realized medicine probably, the sciences, the pure sciences probably wasn't really me, or,
Yeah.
or the sciences. I was probably better suited to the humanities. It's
Mm,
no accident that I did a master's along the way in bioethics because I was just really
right.
drawn to those ethical dilemmas that come up for
Mm,
doctors. And so
mm,
that part of it, I probably felt more engaged and alive than I did actually in the crunching the science of it.
yeah.
I enjoyed the
Yeah.
people interaction. Where I ended
Yeah.
up working most was in emergency medicine. But I think if I'd
Mm.
had some people along the way who could have called out of me what they saw.
Yeah, and I've often used that, often had the opportunity to talk to church leaders specifically about identifying emerging leaders within their congregation and in the context of, and send them to Pathways Bible College.
Yeah, I was going to say,
That's kind of the
your
idea.
name is a good one. Yeah.
Because that's a thing, a real thing, of trying to see, leaders grow up and come up through the ranks, and in many ways is a challenge that the church is facing. And just sort of, and where my very limited knowledge that's just come from, kind of casual conversations that you and I have had about emerging adulthood, I've sometimes given my sort of 2 or 3 minute version of it in those settings, those workshops. And even just that, there's a penny drop for a lot of people. And it's an invitation, I think, for those who have kind of a bit further down the path
Yes.
to actually go, you know what, step in there. And if you see somebody who you think you could see them going along this kind of path, that they've maybe got the gifts and the aptitude for it, it might help them out a little bit to let them know, because that period of exploration can also feel like just you're adrift.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just sort of recognizing that just because somebody hasn't put up their hand in church to say, hey, I want to become a pastor, or I want to do theological study, or what have you, doesn't mean that they're decided against it.
No.
It just might mean that they're just kind of groping around trying to find their way through.
Yeah, and the Lord might use the most, or not flippant remark, but a remark you think is pretty unspectacular. God might just sort of piggyback in on that and just really use that to get somebody thinking along
Yeah.
a path they hadn't before. I mean,
Yeah,
going
absolutely.
back to medicine, one of the reasons I ended up in emergency, which is where I spent most of my time in the last few years, was that I was just doing a rotation in it. It happened to be in that hospital in Perth, because when I did that switch, that swap exchange with another young doctor, I ended up in the emergency department there. And just one of the consultants there, one of the older guys, one of the specialists in that area, just said to me one day, man, your personality is just really well suited to this. He said, you're doing a really good job. You're able to bounce between things quite well without getting overwhelmed. You're not too flustered by stuff when it happens, or when it's suddenly thrust upon you like that. And you also don't get bogged down in detail. We can't get bogged down in detail here. That happens up on the ward. They can dot every I and cross every T, but our job is to triage and to get through people quite quickly. And I was like, oh wow, that's kind of awesome. And that just meant that I did another rotation in it, but later on, and then I found myself being gravitated from just a throwaway comment and an observation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do want to kind of qualify what I was saying too before, because I know when someone from a Bible college is sort of saying, hey, send more people to Bible college, the flip side of that is, that the Lord needs his servants in every part of life and every kind of sphere. And so it is just genuinely looking at the person and how God has equipped them, and then, just speaking into that. Yeah, sounds really great to me. I want to say too, on that note, that a huge thing in my life, I mean, maybe the closest thing I ever came, given that I grew up in a church family, the closest thing I came to a sort of dramatic conversion experience was attending a Venn conference
Right.
as a young adult. and it was their ability to frame vocation, and I guess without using these words, frame that the whole stage of life that at that stage was ahead of me, that sort of a young adulthood, emerging adulthood, to frame it in terms of, I guess, God's mission, and in a quite a broad way, I think was life-changing for me. So
Yeah.
I know that Ven are still doing those conferences.
Summer
and then
conference
the
is still going.
fellowships.
Yep, ven.org.nz, jump on, have a look at
Yeah.
the summer conference, that's still going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a big fan of that myself. Anyway.
And look, the final one I called stability in service. So at a time that's going to be unstable almost by definition, what are the anchor points of stability in that time? What sort of things, what sort of changes is an emerging adult going to make so that they've got some anchor points? And you almost have to make sure you've got them yourself. And so examples often the best examples came from some of the fellows that I was working with on that residential fellowship program as I interviewed them. They would say things like, I can remember one of them saying, look, I'd just started uni, I'd just changed the courses I was taking, a whole lot of stuff was up for grabs, so I stayed in the same church. I just decided that even though there was a huge temptation to want to go where, young adults were flocking to all of these other churches that seemed like there were bright lights in these other places, I just wanted to be able to on Sunday walk in the door, see mum and dad there, but also several older people who had known me for years and could really check in on how I was going. And she just made that conscious decision to stay there for a few more years just because it could be an anchor point. Yeah. And so what are those anchor points going to be? It might be, and there's even a term for this because it happens so much, boomeranging back home to stay with mum and dad. So there's a name for that too. Yeah. That noun has become a verb. Yeah. Boomeranging back home to stay with mum and dad. It can be talked about in some really pejorative ways, but actually it can be a really good thing. Actually, yes, heaps is changing. Mum and dad, do you mind if I come back, live with you for 6 months? They might want to know that there's an end point to it. Yeah. But just to do that can be an anchor point at a time of life. And people report some really rich experiences going back home, oftentimes. And then service as almost a subcategory of that, something that can specifically offer stability, particularly within a new community. So church is the most obvious example, and got to be careful talking about church and service, particularly with young adults. I think serving in church is something that can be prone to some manipulation, perhaps some abuse. And I know we've seen church examples here of internship programs and other things where that's become problematic. But let's not flush that out to our detriment, right? Let's not neglect that as an entire thing that we do. In fact, we're called to contribute in particular ways. Our church has this saying that we don't blast newcomers in the face with this, but we're a waka, not a cruise ship. Pick up an oar, help us paddle. We're going in this direction. We'd love your help if you can. If you've arrived here, you need to take a break. There's personal stuff you're working on for sure. We can be a hospital too. Yeah. But once you've journeyed, we're not a cruise liner. You sit back and on your deck chair sort of thing. I like that. I like that we contribute. And again, one of the best observations came from someone who had moved to Wellington to go to uni. It was a new church. I think she had joined the choir or something. But she realized that, if she didn't feel like going, she could text them in the morning of church and go, hey, I'm not going to be there. And the choir would drop from 29 people to 28 and no one would really sort of care, So So she noticed that and said, actually, I'm going to volunteer to lead a group of 11-year-old girls on a Sunday. And that way, if I don't turn up, I'm disappointing them. And that just kept her going and kept her there. And I thought that was just a really, really wise observation to make.
No, I think you're touching on something that's really, really insightful. I really love that. So, we've had quite a rambling conversation. So I'm wondering if for the listeners and the viewers out there, if it might just help tidy things up or put a bit of frame around it, if we just quickly recap those two lists of five.
List of five, 100%.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Yeah, so the 5 features of emerging adulthood are identity exploration, instability, self-focus, feeling in between, and then the possibilities and the optimism, the fact that the world's your oyster. And then the things that I suggested part of what my project did was to put out some things that I felt were helpful for discipleship at this time of life. So just sort of in general was conversations around it. So actually just talking about it, naming it, that sort of thing. And I'm going to, because I often give these in different order, I may not get the order exactly right of how we covered them, but a biblical anthropology, so a biblical understanding of who we are as people, and then the identity and vocational implications of that, of being grounded in Christ. Experiencing God, like knowing that God knows us, creating space for God to speak to us, creating space for us to connect with the triune God in whatever suits our particular posture or proclivity. For some people that's going to be much more meditative forms than others. I can remember someone saying to me once that we were both going to a Pentecostal church, and he said Pentecostals don't realize how much of a charismatic experience studying can be. He was actually doing his master's at the time. He's like, the Spirit's meeting me in the pages of these century-old texts. So experiencing God, knowing God. Cultural discernment, being able to discern what's going on in the culture around us. Finding saints and exemplars, people who can help us in the journey, particularly in the area of relationships and in our work, in our job, in our vocation. And then the one we just touched on finally, which is what are going to be some anchor points of stability and perhaps service that can anchor us in that time.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
I can see, this is one of those things where I think almost everyone cares about it, because, there's groups like, there's the emerging adults themselves.
Yes.
Who need to hear some of this stuff. There's parents of emerging adults, or those that will one day be emerging adults, that need to hear it.
Yep.
And then those in ministry and church leadership, that need to hear it.
Yep.
Are there ways that people can engage with you if they want to take this conversation further in those kinds of settings?
Yeah, yep, for sure. So I'm really happy for people just to flick me an email. So my email is bloore.sam@gmail.com. So that's Bloore, BL, @gmail.com. Really happy if people just want to flick me an email. And I've referenced a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it I've probably attributed wrong quotes to wrong people. That's what kind of happens a couple of years on when it gets a little bit fuzzy in your mind. You remember the big buckets of things, but can flick people any number of resources. Maybe a couple of book recommendations. There's one called Spiritual Formation in Emerging Adulthood, I think is the title of it. And that's by Sertran and Kiesling. Sertran, Sertran, I think, and Kiesling. If you just Google those two authors and emerging adulthood, you'll find their book. It was written a bunch of years ago now, maybe even 12 years ago, but it gives just a really good summary of the stage of life, and then some of the big areas where emerging adults are needing help and discipleship. I found that one of the most helpful summary books. So that's good, particularly for people in ministry. Maybe a book for parents. My supervisor, Stephen Argue, co-authored a book with Cara Powell called Growing With, and it's for parents who are going to grow with their kids. I really like that concept. We're growing with them as they get older.
Yeah.
And that's they did that for teenagers and then emerging adults, and they said teenagers need something quite different to the first half of the emerging adult years, and that's quite different to the second half of the emerging adult years. So they're the explorers and the focusers. So teenagers, then the explorers, and then focusers. They need three different things from us as parents. And I remember reading the book because I had to. When your supervisor has written a book, mental note, read it. But I remember reading it going, Jules, I know I read this because I had to, but this is great, and this is gonna forearm us to as our kids begin to enter those years. As I say, our eldest is 13, about to turn 14 next week. And so I feel like I've read that book just in time. We're going to work through that together. Some of the, things in that. A couple of book recommendations. Maybe one final thought. On this, Richard, one of the most helpful, I think, overall phenomena that I heard referred to, or things that I discovered. I hadn't heard this phrase before, but one of the commentators introduced me to this concept of cultural scripts or social scripts. And these are often unspoken narratives that different communities live by. And so they say there's these unwritten expectations that over time develop and can sometimes fossilize into really strong kind of grooves that you feel you need to follow. And so families will have them, churches will have them, different wider culture has got them, and often they're never spoken about. But they're in the ether. We're swimming in the milieu, and we don't even know that they're there. So an example, like an unspoken cultural script in our family was, you're going to university. You know, if I'd come home and announced that, you know, that was it, I was packing it in, I was going to do, you know, something, I would have had to answer to somebody for that, you know. Never spoken about. There was this expectation that you were heading off to university. Now, I'd like to think that in my family it's going to be a bit wider than that. No, I don't blame mum and dad for that, you know, but just that, you know, maybe a more creative pathway might have been open to us. Well, what if one of us had wanted to go into one of the skilled manual professions, you know, gone doing an apprenticeship somewhere, or gone into, say, the more creative arts, where doing a degree is not as important as perhaps doing some other ways forward. But what I'd love to see happen is that church communities become places where we hold a number of scripts open. Whatever the script that God is calling you to follow is, we will prayerfully walk alongside you and support you in that. Because I think emerging adults know if they're caught in a place where they're not following it, you know. So if you meet the person that you feel called to marry, that your relationship is moved, is developed, is matured, and you want to get married at 21, then with the right people around you, agreeing with you in that, giving you advice, do it. If you find yourself in your mid-30s, still single, maybe going to be single forever, who knows, we'll support you in that as well. There's not a hard, rigid script you have to follow here. Obviously, there's gospel-shaped scripts that we're all following within our communities, of course, but these social and cultural scripts, you're not going to be on the outer if God asks you to walk a path that's slightly different to what's going on. We're going to help you in a range of those. I just found that a really helpful concept to name something that I'd certainly bumped into many times in my life, and going, we can be places that do better than that.
I think it's important, and it's a great way to frame it, because we can be, the very nature of the scripts is that they're sort of pre-reflective. We absorb them without thinking about them, and then you find that, you know, there's all these sorts of things that, a little bit like the Pharisees, we layer in on top of discipleship that perhaps we don't intend to, but become these unspoken rules of how to be a Christian. You know, I think, for example, you know, our mutual friend, Carter Calloway, wrote a book called Breaking the Marriage Idol.
Yes.
Just naming the fact that, you know, I guess one of those scripts in evangelicalism is tended to be, you get married. That's just an expectation that's what flourishing adult Christianity looks like.
Yes.
But actually, we need to be quite intentional in our faith communities of allowing people who are following a different script, a script of, you know, a call to singleness, to be able to let them to live into that as well. So I guess for church leaders to just reflect a little bit on, well, what are the scripts that are, as you said, in the ether in our own faith community, and then how do we bring a bit of balance to that? Man, it's been good talking with you. I love this topic. There's so much in it. I'm looking forward to further conversations that you have in all sorts of other forums and so on, because I think it's really rich. And
apologies
really
to your listeners if we've blown the time out too, mate. I have the rather dubious title of being the record holder for the longest sermon ever delivered at our church, and I feel like I might have just done the same for your podcast, mate. Sorry,
No, it's all good. That's
the
great thing about this medium is it doesn't matter. It's all good.
Yeah.
No, it's been great. It's been a great.
Feel free to edit
so
it
thanks,
down
Sam.
as much as you need to, mate. Thank you,
Appreciate
man.
being here.
Thanks a lot.
Sam. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk soon.
Kia ora.
Bye.